Hello, and thank you for joining us here at the Wild Dog AI podcast, brought to you by Indago Technologies, where we're tracking the future of intelligence and security with the precision and agility of the African wild dog. My name is Buddy, and together we'll deep dive how generative AI is impacting the landscape of security, intelligence, and beyond. Welcome back to the Wild Dog AI podcast. In the last episode, we talked a lot about how to build custom reports on top of language models. We talked about the difference in building those reports directly in the ChatGPT UI and using them in, a purpose-built platform for report building like Indago. We talked about some best practices and how prompts tie into that. But this week, I have with me on the show Heather Perez, our senior analyst at Indago, and Amy Doe, our chief marketing officer. Heather and Amy, do you guys want to take a second and introduce yourselves?
So I'm Heather Perez. I've been at Indago for a year now, and prior to that, I spent 23 years in law enforcement. I spent most of that time at a local fusion center here in the Central Florida area, where I focus primarily on extremist and terrorist use of social media.
I am Amy Doe. Over 20 years experience in the advertising agency, helping brands craft their stories and helping connect brands build out customer journeys, both in the ag world for B2B and B2C companies. And now here at Indago for the last a little over a year now.
Well, Amy, thanks for being on the show today. And what a lot of people may not know, you don't advertise this, so of course they wouldn't know, but you also recently completed the OSC certification, the open source certification. So I think you're officially an OSINTer now.
I mean, according to LinkedIn, if it's true on LinkedIn, it's got to be real, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously you're very good at what you do in the marketing world, but we've been working together for several years now, and you've written a lot of OSINT articles. You've met a lot of people in the OSINT space, so I'd say you're not just a marketer anymore. I think you're pretty close to being considered an OSINTer as well.
I have a certificate to prove it.
There you go. So what I wanted to jump into today, which I think is pretty interesting, is there's a lot going on in the AI world. And Amy, thanks for being here, because I really want to get your perspective on this too, because I know like you and I talk on Slack quite a bit. Heather, you share articles and we talk on Slack. And you two probably in Indago right now are the two that probably are out there reading the most articles, trying to learn as much as you can about generative AI. I think it's been awesome. I've learned a lot from you guys. But Amy, you're not just looking at it from the security perspective and the intel perspective. You've been sharing a lot of some of the pretty awesome new generative AI capabilities in the marketing space as well. So recently, Ilya Sutskever, and for those of you who do not know him, he's an Israeli Canadian-born scientist, studied at University of Toronto under Geoffrey Hinton. And for those of you who don't know who he is, he's considered the godfather of AI, probably one of the brightest AI minds in the space. But Ilya was hence pursued by Elon Musk to go work at OpenAI when Elon Musk made that initial donation to OpenAI several years back. And so I think he's been the chief data scientist there for almost 10 years now. He was also behind the board's move. This is based on what I'm reading in the media. I obviously don't know him, but based on what was reported in the media, he played a pretty significant role in trying to remove Sam Altman from the CEO position. That was unsuccessful. Microsoft stepped in and I think made a decision that wasn't going to happen. But what we do know about Ilya is throughout his time at OpenAI and throughout his time studying under Geoffrey Hinton, he's always been an advocate of building safety protocols around these language models. And frankly, he should know. He's an AI maximalist, I think is what he's referred to. And essentially what that means is he believes the larger the model, the language model, the more capable that language model becomes. And in recent articles, he said on a few occasions that he thinks we're closer to AGI, artificial general intelligence, than most people think. And so it seems like he's made this move now to leave OpenAI to start his new company. And his new company is Safe Superintelligence Incorporated. There's not a lot of information out there right now about SSI, but it sounds like their goal is to be solely focused on building a language model and building other technologies that ensure that these language models stay safe and essentially don't go rogue, especially as we approach AGI. So what I wanted to talk to you guys about today is what are some of the things this new company could possibly do to help law enforcement and the federal government in thinking about how to protect our national security, our nation's secrets, protect our service members from these models as they get bigger and they continue to grow. And obviously, our adversaries have access to these things as well. And so, Heather, first for you, as you look at this through a law enforcement lens, if you were to be the founder of a company like SSI, what are some of the things you would be focused on from a law enforcement perspective, based on what you've been hearing from the folks that you've been engaging over the past few weeks that are just starting to use generative AI in the security space?
Well, some of the tools that are out there, if you understand how to use them correctly, provide a lot of good like resource optimization. So a lot of these new tools that are incorporating the AI can get some of the monotonous stuff that you have to do every day, some of the little things out of the way so you can focus on providing the proper support to your community. Whether that be like something like our system and Indago, where it helps you write your reports quicker, where it processes it and you can focus on the so what, or whether it be different types of tools that help you sort through the data. It can help you when you're looking at a lot of these tools and you're looking at law enforcement or even the intel community, like understanding the tools that are out there and what they can do, not only how they can help you do your day-to-day job, but also how to counter the individuals that you're looking at, the malicious actors. So they could help you enhance threat detection. So you can use certain tools that help you sort through data quicker, so that way you can identify potential trends and methodologies and potential threats quicker. So that way it just increases the time or decreases the time that it takes you to follow up on certain leads. It helps you process and get through what you can't really get around mis and disinformation right now. But if you have something that could help you sort through that data and kind of parse out those bad tips and leads so you can focus on the information that really matters. There's just so much, there's like data overload right now. And as much as you want to be able to sort through this data on your own and look at everything, that's just not humanly possible. You have to have some type of advanced tools to help you sort through this efficiently in order to be able to do your job effectively.
That you bring up an interesting point, right? Obviously, with the use of generative AI, content could be produced so easily and so quickly now. And so there is I've already started to see some of it, but there is an overwhelming amount of data sort of being put out on the internet now, being shared across the digital space. And so you think a company like SSI, if they could start to build some technologies to help combat that flood of information, sift through that flood of information, sort of dissect that flood of information to know when you're looking at data that's coming from a language model or data that's coming from a real person. I guess that's some of the ways a company like SSI could start to essentially protect our national security, obviously, but to protect good people, right? Protect us from the bad guys, because that flood of data, and we're even seeing it in cyber attacks, ransomware. AI is now creating all sorts of cyber threats. And so maybe that's one of the areas that SSI is, I guess what you're saying is that's probably one of the areas SSI could really have a pretty big impact fairly quickly.
Yeah, AI is kind of interesting because it's kind of dual use. It can be used for good to help with your day-to-day operations, to help you with your intelligence gathering, all of that. But it can also be a negative because you also have to consider that the threat actors that mean to do harm to our country also have access to the same technology. So if you don't have a good understanding of the new tools that are coming out and how you can use them to your benefit, and on the flip side, how they can be exploited, it is going to get to a point where you can't, for law enforcement, for intel community folks, they won't be able to do their job effectively if they don't understand this new technology that's coming out.
Interesting. And what about so that data that we find on platforms like X, Instagram, Snapchat. What about videos? Like, right, videos are advancing very, very quickly right now. I've seen some videos recently created by AI companies like Stability that can produce lifelike images, right? And so, what about the idea of creating some sort of protocols and some sort of technologies to know what's real and what's not, right? Because I could imagine like events being created in the digital space that aren't happening in physical space being promoted by bad actors and causing chaos for people.
Yes, that would be very helpful for videos, for deepfake videos, AI generated photos. It's gotten to the point where there's so much flooded on social media right now that it's hard to tell what is real and what is fake anymore. I mean, just over, I think in the last week or so, there was a news report about an individual that won a contest that was supposed to be a contest looking at AI generated photos, but his photo was real and they didn't know his was a real photo. So that's on the opposite side. More often than not, it's AI generated photos that are looking more and more like real photos.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, with the task force that we're standing up, the Protecting Children's Innocence Task Force, you know, a lot of what we see in that space is the sextortion that's occurring across the United States. I can't imagine, you know, if I'm looking at these new technologies, if I'm sitting at a company like SSI and I'm wanting to tackle the biggest threats to our society, sextortion's got to be up there, right? Sextortion's got to be at the top of that list.
Well, it's one that's been gaining a lot of momentum, particularly in the last 6 months or so, because there's been changes in the tactics where these folks that are doing the sextortion are targeting teenage boys in particular. And over the last couple of years, because of the sextortion, I think there's been like 32 suicides of teenagers because of the sextortions that are using deepfake videos and fake photos and different AI technology to enhance their operations.
Well, you bring up a good point, right? Enhance operations. Yeah, I mean, this technology gives them the ability to basically scale these threats and scale these attacks and scale their operations. And that's, I don't know. I hope as they're standing up, this new company, SSI, I hope that's one of the things they're thinking about is how do we prevent language models from enabling these bad actors to scale these operations that are killing, you know, kids across America right now.
I think when they're building these language models, that something that needs a big issue that needs to be taken into consideration is, yes, so you're building it to do these certain things. Well, how can people with bad intentions reverse engineer that to use it for their purposes? So
I think that's a great point because it'll be interesting to see how Ilya defines safe, right? Because in my opinion, I also feel like we have a little bit of catching up to do. I think Heather hit on a great point in the sense of like, this is a tool, but no different than a hammer or anything else. That tool can be used for both good and bad. So for those that are used to certain workflows, it's a matter of learning this technology and understanding what your adversaries can use against you, because most people, like to your point, Heather, children can go on there for something innocent, but to the technology, it's just a data point. So it makes it easier and more scalable to be able to get your target. So for all parties, everyone needs to learn how to use that to be able to understand the strategies and how do we combat that, because all of those data points tell a different narrative, and it's just dependent on whose hands that data falls into in their particular strategy. So to even that playing field, we have a little bit of catching up to do. I would argue, or I would love to hear how safety is defined and how we can implement and educate the public so they can also participate and use the digital platforms safely.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing an interview with Elon Musk a couple months ago where somebody asked him, posited the question, what if AI gets out of control and we lose control of it? What if it does achieve singularity or sentience and starts to make its own decisions? I think his answer was, we better have access to the plug. so we can unplug it, right? But that's a real thing. As these models continue to grow and as these models continue to get more capable, obviously not just good guys are using these models, bad guys are using these models as well. And so we touched on how these models can produce overwhelming amounts of content that could be used for misinformation or to persuade the public in one direction or another around a topic. We talked about how these technologies like Stability AI, and there's a lot of competitors to Stability now, are producing lifelike images and lifelike videos that can also be used to things like sextortion. Amy, from your perspective, as you've been playing with a lot of different tools and kind of looking at the safety of AI from a different perspective, and I agree with you, like defining safety is a pretty important thing. But what other threats do you see? If you were at SSI and you were part of the founding team, what are some of the things you'd be focused on from a safety and security perspective?
I think the biggest thing is, even though similar to the technology of GI being able to scale mis and disinformation so quickly, it's the matter of we recognize that the consumption of all this content is so quick and starting at a very, very young age, right? And so I think being able to implement, if we're taking a look at safe superintelligence, if there is some verification that this is legit, or to encourage curiosity of what questions there are. For example, I love going in and asking an LLM a question, but then it prompts, hey, do you want to dig deeper in this? And I think that's a good initial step in encouraging more curiosity rather than just looking at an image or watching a video and coming up to your own conclusion. I read a study, I can't remember if it's Gartner or Adobe, that people are now turning to LLMs for mental health, for health issues, things that still you need that professional element. So it is just one data point as you're doing research. So that's my encouragement is, as we're doom scrolling, as I do every night, ask the secondary question to continue the story so it doesn't just end there.
Well, you actually, I mean, the cybersecurity component is another big deal. Like I've definitely done that. So like I've built a GPT that includes all of my medical records. I've uploaded all the data from my Garmin watch, all of my data from Peloton, my DNA results, my blood work, and I've created my own personal medical assistant, and I converse with it every day. Every day after I get done exercising, I upload my workout into that GPT. I add it to the knowledge. And I have conversations about it. Like, hey, my goal is to lose 15 pounds in the next 3 weeks, or next 2 months. I wish I could lose 15 pounds in 3 weeks. But my question is to the language model is, how do I get on a diet to make me more healthy? How do I improve my VO2 max? How many times a week should I be doing certain types of workouts? And it's pretty accurate. And so the protection of that data is obviously pretty important to me. And so I think that's another area where a company like SSI can really focus is on how do we combat some of these inevitable cybersecurity attacks that are going to continue to occur and continue to happen. So we touched on really three. Then it's the overwhelming content that's coming. How do we protect people from being persuaded, victims of misinformation, as a result of the overwhelming amount of content that language models are already producing, frankly. Secondly, how do we protect people from the videos, the lifelike videos and lifelike images, and the potential reality of fake events occurring in the digital space, not really a physical space, but being sold as a major event? I could see how that could sow significant discord across Western societies. And then finally, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is obviously going to become a pretty big challenge as our adversaries start to leverage these models. We already know on GitHub that AI is writing a pretty significant amount of the code on GitHub now. I think it's, last time I checked, 45%. So it's probably, we're probably not far, unless it may already be happening, where AI is basically able to write its own malware and basically conduct its own attacks with very little guidance. So I think that's probably a pretty significant area that a company like SSI could focus.
Yeah. I mean, You summarized it perfectly. I think it's just a matter of, Heather, you're right, too much content overload, and hopefully SSI is going to help us filter that. And then it's a GPT that we can all make sure that we filter what's safe, what's malware, what's to educate us without too much of a heavy lift, because as we know, sometimes we're all juggling many balls in responsibilities.
Well, when you're looking at like the ethical use of the AI, and even if you do it, so if I'm playing devil's advocate on the other side for those that might be uncomfortable with AI, so everybody, there are a lot of people that use AI, Chat GPT, and all for various different things. But as you're utilizing all of these different things, if you don't understand how they work and how you're getting the results that you're getting, then you could inadvertently feed the misinformation. So if I'm, writing a report and I tell Chat GPT or some other program to write my report for me, and I'm using one that's, like where it's training the models back, and I don't make any edits, I'm just using the paper as it is, and there's misinformation in there. Something's misquoted, something's not written right, and I've finished it, sent it off as being good. And so then you could potentially have some of these language models that are learning information that isn't correct because we aren't correcting it, because you still have to have that human element in there, and could just start building on misinformation that we've developed on our own because we haven't taken the time, because we become too dependent. So it's like you want to learn how to use it responsibly, because it can be a huge time saver, but at the same time, you can't be so trusting that you just blindly say, okay, it's done. I'm not even going to read it. I'm sure it did a wonderful job for me. Well, and just when Google's added in their AI for when you do your searches and it gives you responses, like everybody was sharing one of the responses because they tied their search pulls information from Reddit now. So it was pulling from different Reddit posts. It pulled one from years ago, and the question was, how can I make the cheese on my, not slide off my pizza? And Google's AI response was to add Elmer's glue. And that sounds ridiculous, but some people might hear that and think, okay, well, that sounds weird, but I'm going to do it. And I mean, I would hope that they wouldn't, but somewhere out there is someone that will, because it's on the internet. Google told me to do it. So it's just one of those things. There has to be a good balance on like building the super intelligence, but also as, everyday users, we have to understand how that technology is working and what it's doing so we can make sure we're using it properly too, or else none of it's going to work well, because there has to be that balance on both sides in order to
we've
be
talked
most
about, I
efficient.
think, some of the areas that SSI
Exactly.
can potentially help here. And I think there's a whole nother field that's I've been reading about recently, where there are actually surgeons for language models now, like people that actually study the hidden layers and inside of language models. You've probably seen there's been some podcasts recently where the CEOs of some of these major companies are essentially saying that we don't really have a full understanding of how these language models, because they're so large now, are arriving, or specifically arriving at their conclusions that they arrive at sometimes. And so there has been this sort of movement towards a whole new occupational field where people actually perform analysis and surgery on the language models. Maybe that's another area SSI gets involved in. With Ilya Sutskever's background, it would make sense, right? That's an area where he understands those hidden layers. He obviously understands deep learning. But maybe that's another place that they could play a role, is essentially building technologies that can perform analysis and derive deep insights on how these neural nets are essentially working. I could see a whole new space here coming about, where just like you have cybersecurity professionals do pen testing, red teaming, purple teaming, I think that's a whole nother area that's got to be created around these language models. Like who's doing that? Who's doing that deep analysis of how the language model is actually operating, and what tools and technologies do we need to develop to understand how those synapses inside those language models, which are layers, how they're communicating and why they're communicating the way they are. I mean, the parameters in these models are massive, trillions. ChatGPT's in trillions now. So That's quite a big task to understand how they actually operate. And so maybe that's another area that SSI comes in and takes the lead, which is developing that whole new tool set of cybersecurity tools that actually study these models.
I didn't even think of that, but I think that's a necessary and an area of regulation that I hope SSI or somebody does take a look at as safety becomes a more increasing demand, and hopefully gives people ease in the fact of like, okay, well, generative AI or this emerging technology is going to take over our jobs. Well, no, because it's only as good as the data that we provide for it or analyze. So I think that regulation factor hopefully is taken into consideration.
Well, and it's going to become a bigger deal as the Department of Defense starts to use them, right? We talked recently about the Air Force moving ChatGPT to NIFR, which is basically the unclassified version of the internet for them to use. Well, I imagine that the DoD is going to absolutely start to require some levels of protocols to understand what's actually happening in these language models before they can be used too much within military applications. So that may be a whole nother area of opportunity for a company like SSI. Like, for instance, when software typically goes into the Department of Defense, there's a lot of different security compliances that exist. I think a lot of people have heard of them, like SOC 2, STIG, so forth and so on. But it is going to be interesting to see how they evolve, how these security protocols evolve around language models, because it's completely new technology. And if the CEOs of these big companies aren't really sure how these language models are arriving at the conclusions they're arriving at, how's anybody else going to know that, right? So that there could be some really opportunity there for SSI. So what I'd be interested in hearing from both of you on is, I don't know that people understand how much these language models have actually become a part of the technologies they're already using. I'll give you an example. I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I was meeting on Teams, and Teams has this now ability for you to basically communicate with Teams and search and ask questions while you're on the platform. Funny enough, the person I was talking to, what they were telling me is that they're not using generative AI yet. That their command won't let them use it. There's no policy around it. And I had to explain to them that you do realize that you're using it right now. When you do those searches in Teams, you're essentially using generative AI that's feeding a lot of the Microsoft platform. So you're actually already using the technology, but because it's not ChatGPT, you don't think you're using generative AI. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But what technologies are you seeing that have already started to use generative AI that people might not be aware of?
So on the law enforcement or just Intel community, just a lot of the programs and platforms that are being utilized now have incorporated AI in some manner, like facial recognition. A lot of the different programs that are doing trend analysis or doing summarizations, almost everything has some type of a little bit of AI. Even if it's not like super advanced yet, it's started in some manner, and it's been in most of these for several years. It's just growing now and being talked about more.
Yeah, I'd imagine that most of the software, the commercial off-the-shelf software that law enforcement and the DoD is using, is incorporating this stuff on the back end already, right? So that could be a big problem if you have a policy, your unit has a policy that you're not going to use large language models or generative AI in your daily work. However, 3 of the software platforms you're logging in to do your work already have it incorporated into them, right? That could present a real challenge. And I honestly, I don't know how the government's addressing that right now. Maybe that's an area for SSI. That's another area of an opportunity there for a company like Safe Superintelligence.
They've got their hands full then, because you're right. Like, it's kind of hard to escape it. I think I was telling you the other day, buddy, when I had a dentist appointment, and I was fascinated. Normally I just lay back, I watch my HGTV, but this time I was fascinated because they have new software. And when they did the x-rays for my teeth, it was all Gen AI. They could easily target based on data they had already input in there, where there were problems and where they really had to hone in versus waiting for the dentist. So all that data is being collected. If you think about it, you didn't need technology, always existed to get the data points. Now it's just a matter of like knitting those data sets together to be able to analyze it quicker. I mean, you're scrolling through Facebook, LinkedIn, that element is included. You're writing in an email or you're even searching on Google right now. It's taking on the right hand side, giving you LLM, Gemini's LLM output as well as search, right? Because they're using those two products in tandem, knowing what people search, but then also just learn behavior. So it's hard to escape.
Well, even now on some of the social media sites like Facebook and then Meta, so Facebook, Instagram, like any of theirs, they've incorporated their Meta AI. So all your searches are AI searches. Even just generally now going to the Wendy's fast food, they have an AI taking artificial intelligence taking your order. I got a call to schedule a doctor's appointment and they're using AI now to do all their scheduling. So it's kind of coming in and taking over and being incorporated into everything now.
Well, that's interesting too, right? Because I think a lot of the pushback we get from some people that aren't using or, have convinced themselves that they're not yet using generative AI, although they probably are, they just don't know it. One of the biggest fears is that they don't want their information going into these language models. But I think a lot of these language models were trained on internet data where their data already existed. And so I think that's another interesting question I don't think anybody's really answered yet, which is who had control over what data was used on the internet to train models and how much of that was PII data? Right? How much do they already know about you?
Exactly. And like that's
And
all kind of unknown
yeah.
too, right? In regards to regulations, because I had an argument with somebody the other day, you know how everyone's like, oh, your phones are listening to you. And then the ad pops up, right? And someone's like, that's not possible because you can't buy that ad. And I'm like, how do you think they'd prove it later on? You need the case study to sell something first. So I'd argue that the data is already there. We're giving the data. So it's now more a matter of like, what do they do with it? I think we're past the collecting phase and now more about the output.
Yeah, that's exactly. And Heather, what about like the idea of, I had a clearance in the military. A lot of people in the intel community do. And everybody knows about our records being stolen over and over and over again. I think I have dark web monitoring till I'm about 160 years old right now. Because every time there's another breach, they send me, 5 more years of dark web monitoring. But that brings up an interesting point, kind of what Amy was alluding to, which is if I wanted to download a model from Mistral or Databricks, I get to pick the data I fine-tune that model with. Well, what prevents me from downloading a bunch of breach data from the dark web and then building a special model that includes all the PII data of people in the law enforcement or intelligence community?
I mean, there's not really anything that stops you from doing that. And that's one of the other things too with it, learning from the internet and all that too. So let's say as a law enforcement analyst or, working as an intel analyst, like trying to train other analysts and stuff and trying to teach them that just because something is on open source doesn't mean you can use it. So like if there's a leak of classified documents and it's written about by a news agency, you still can't write about that classified stuff. You can't put it in a product. And when it gets so disjointed and distorted and pieces of it here and there, it gets to the point where you don't know. I mean, even without the AI, with it being used in different things, and AI just kind of amplifies that even more. So in some instances, like without knowing what the models and how they trained and what they trained on, you don't know exactly where the information you're using is coming from all the time. But like I've always liked to go, like, I like to know if someone were to search for me, I like to know what they would find on me. Breach data, or like what's available. And it was scary before with just regular OSINT tools. But now with everything else, it's it's a lot.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to Amy. You spend a lot of time in marketing, and you spend a lot of time, building content for audiences and studying those audiences to make sure that the product that you're building is a good fit. Obviously, so that you can sell whatever product it is you're working with. And what I'd like to hear your thoughts about is, I think we talked about this a few days ago. I had a conversation a few weeks ago with somebody who said, we were talking about humanoid robots, and they said, I would never let a robot watch my kid, right? And my response to them was, well, what happened when you put them in the backseat of your car and hand them your phone to play a game on, or the phone to keep them busy? I mean, just because your phone isn't shaped like a robot doesn't mean it's not acting like a robot, right? It's essentially a robot. And so I still think, like, in conversations we have, like the conversation about, I would never use generative AI because I'm afraid, I don't want to give it my data, not understanding that it may already have that data. Or I would never have a humanoid robot watch my kid, not taking into consideration that a robot is already watching your kid most of the day when they're sitting on their iPad or looking at their phone or watching TV all day, especially if they're on YouTube. What is it about people where they kind of have a hard time adapting to these things? And then how, what has to happen, like, for them to, I just feel like they get worried about the thing that you're talking about. They're fearful of that product because of what they read, and then it's just no, 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 and then at some point there's like an adoption by the masses, and it just becomes the norm. And I feel like that's kind of what's happening with generative AI, right? Like, we are normalizing things so quickly. Like when ChatGPT first came out, it was like, oh my God, this is the best thing since sliced bread. Here we are, only a year and a half later, we're like, it's okay. It's not that great, right? And we're finding all its flaws. But what is that about the human mind in the marketing world with adoption?
I feel like it's the classic, you have your early adopters, right? Like they always want the new shiny thing, so they dive in. And then there are those who it does take a little bit of time to kind of jump in, or they don't know that they're actually using the technology and they start to realize it. And then there's those that have the fear, right? But then they start to like hear it more. It's the same people who don't go to Krispy Kreme until they see a really long line and they're like, what am I missing out? They overcome the fear because fear or FOMO, it's almost like one or the other. And so once it hits that FOMO and they start to see the benefits of it, but I fear that once you get the FOMO, you're forgetting, or we're forgetting that it's not that binary. It's not like I either use it or I don't use it. It's a matter of where's the value in it, so you can be better at your job. You can be a better babysitter. Like, sure, it can babysit you, but there also has to be limitations. You just can't say, yes, I don't need to be a parent anymore because this robot's going to be it. Like, there can't be too much of a good thing, if we can say that, right? Like, there has to be that self-reliant in you building the guardrails. Otherwise, you do feed into the fear of like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden this robot is now raising my child.
Yeah. Well, we did a poll. I kind of feel like we're seeing this with cars too, autonomous vehicles. There was research done recently that showed that a human driving a car gets in an accident every 190,000 miles. A driver-assisted autonomous vehicle gets in an accident like every 400,000 miles, I think was the data. And then a fully autonomous vehicle gets in an accident, like it's over 1 million miles before a fully autonomous vehicle would get in an accident. But human beings, I just don't think, are ready to jump in cars and let the cars drive themselves yet, right? And so what's happening, I think, in the car industry, we rented a car for my daughter's soccer tournament 2 weeks ago. It was a brand new Tahoe. And the thing is practically driving itself. I was driving back. It was a 6-hour drive, and I'm on the highway. It's got lane correct on it. It's got all these things on in the car. It's basically a robot on wheels at this point. I can set cruise control. I can set the distance between me and the vehicle in front of me. I can set lane control in. And so the only reason I have to touch the wheel is because they built a safety feature in there. It says, hey, you need to touch the wheel. But if I didn't touch the wheel, the thing would basically drive itself maintain distance from the car in front of us, maintain a speed on its own, and stay in the lane, and even turn in the lanes pretty well on the highway. And so what the product is doing is it's not going from, hey, you're driving a stick shift and now your car's driving itself. It's like the market is slowly moving us and getting us used to fully autonomous vehicles, right? By making new cars easier and easier to drive. I think that's kind of what's happening in the generative AI space with language models, right? Where we don't realize it, but a lot of the technologies that we're using are being, generative AI is being plugged into these platforms, and the user doesn't even know that. We did a poll recently. I think you saw the results, where we asked people how often do they use generative AI at work, and then how often do they use generative AI at home. And I'm pulling up the results right now, but I thought it was interesting. I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on that. On the poll that asked people, what percentage of the day do you spend using generative AI at work? The responses were 0 to 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 30%, or 30% or more. And the 0 to 2% category was 63%. The 30% or more was 19%. And in between that, 10 to 20% was 11%, and 20 to 30% was 7% of people. And so there's still a major gap between the people that use generative AI less than 10%, which was at 63%, and people that use it 30% or more, which is at 19%. And so what are your thoughts on that? Because I feel like maybe those 0 to 10%ers don't necessarily understand that they're actually already using it in some of the applications that they're engaging with each day at work.
I would agree with that. But I think it's like any new thing, and kind of what Amy was mentioning, people are scared of what they don't know. And it's like looking even at like OSINT. So OSINT's really big now, and you can get certified. You see more people talking. There's associations. But if you go back 10 years ago, not a lot of OSINT wasn't something that everybody used, even though they kind of did. Like I could talk to analysts that they say, "Well, I don't do OSINT." Well, you're working gangs. How are you looking at the gangs? How are you tracking them? Well, I'm looking at their social media. I'm looking at their Facebook and their Insta. Well, then you're doing OSINT. That's part of OSINT. So it's kind of goes along with what you're saying, is you don't know it, or you don't think about it that way. They're thinking, I'm tracking this particular, criminal group. I'm not thinking about really that I'm doing OSINT doing it. I'm just following where they are.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening with the AI.
Amy, what I wanted to ask you, Heather talked about the use, we just covered the use of generative AI at work and what our poll showed. Let me ask you, we actually ran another poll about how often people use generative AI like ChatGPT outside of work. And the results of that poll were pretty interesting. 48% of respondents said not at all. 24% of respondents said a few times a week. 5% said at least once a day. And 24% said they use it several times a day. But 48% of respondents said they don't use generative AI like ChatGPT at all. And so I wonder how many of that 48% are all, are they not on social media? Are they not doing searches on Facebook? Because that's generative AI.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit that don't know how to use it, but in my echo chamber, I will also say, like, there are a lot of people who recognize it because it's so blatant, especially on Instagram now, because when you're even just searching a name, it's embedded, you're using generative AI, and it's annoying a lot of people. So you see that a lot in the Reddit forums. But I'd also argue that there is a shift post-pandemic. I don't know if you guys are noticing it in yours too, and I think eMarketer did a study on this. There is a shift in consumer behavior because we were so immersed in engaging with our devices that now it's a matter of like stepping away from all the devices in general. So there's almost like an anti-tech and go live and enjoy life kind of movement that's going on. So if they identify with that, even though they may sneak at a red light, guilty, and like go and search for something, they don't necessarily want to account for that, right? Because I would argue that when you're searching for something, it's a little more secretive. and they don't necessarily feel like they're inputting into the cloud. Where if like generative AI, they're proactively, here's my data. So I think there's a little bit of that mistrust and inaccurate mindset as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I have noticed that shift that like the first I started really to pay attention to that shift from like separating from your devices, reducing your stress at work. As my kids were growing up, they've sort of shifted to this, which is a lot different than I was a kid, where they'd much rather an experience over, like a physical toy, right? That's why kind of one of the reasons Airbnb has grown as big as it is, I think, right? People are seeking out more experiences, getting outdoors, traveling, and trying to get away from these devices as much as possible. So I don't know if that ties into what you're saying, but it absolutely makes sense to me. I feel like we have been trending in that direction, but it's just so hard to get away from it, right?
It is. It's hard to escape it. And I do think that there's, again, I'm pretty sure this is the same e-marketer, but it talks about the trust factor, right? That's why influencers and content creators are becoming almost the go-to source in things, and rather than, I would argue, like news media, especially for younger age groups as well, which can be very dangerous, which is why I am so excited for people who are really putting a priority around safety, because as that becomes that behavior, how do we prevent some of that? Because if somebody can easily go as an influencer, go ahead and put into an LLM. Give me a step-by-step tutorial on how to become an influencer, but it could be an adversary that's trying to build this community. And next thing you know, it's a trap, right? Like, so it's one of those things of like understanding consumer behavior and being able to make those shifts as they may fear it, but there could be an influencer totally feeding on that fear, right?
Yeah. Heather, Amy brought up some pretty good points there. How do you, when you studied some of these adversarial groups, and I know we're going to have a much deeper conversation about the adversarial use of things like language models and AI writ large, but more particularly generative AI. What are some of the ways that we should be thinking about how our adversaries are starting to use this technology based on what you've, like, for instance, you write our child sexual assault material or CSAM newsletter for the task force. And I've noticed in there recently, you have been talking a little bit more about generative AI and how people are using that. What are some of the ways that people are actually doing what Amy is saying, especially in that child exploitation space?
So it's pretty much being used by criminals and threat actors across the board. So on child exploitation, they're creating deepfakes, they're creating AI generated photos. They are, sometimes incorporating like a child. There was someone arrested, I think, in Florida a month or two ago that had taken a photo from a child's face from a yearbook, a school yearbook, and then used the face and generated onto, a naked body. And some of those I find interesting. So, for the language models and some of their restrictions on what you can look at, like I can't summarize an article on child exploitation, but you have some of these threat actors that are learning enough to bypass the security measures in order to generate this kind of stuff. You have cyber threat actors. I think it was like middle of the last year, they started making malicious AI like Worm GPT and Fraud GPT to help them do phishing campaigns and other type of malware activities. You have terrorist organizations that are using it for propaganda and recruitment on TikTok. ISIS is on TikTok, and they're creating videos and notating them as AI to try to get around algorithms that would get them suspended. You have drug cartels that are incorporating AI, and they're doing more fraud scams. So they're making some of the, they're using the AI for making some of like the voice calls and deepfakes and all of that as well. You have nation state actors that are using it for mis and disinformation. The sextortion that you mentioned earlier, a lot of that is taking place on like Instagram and TikTok and places like that.
Well, I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me today to just kind of talk through this, especially the establishment of this new company, Safe Superintelligence. While we don't know exactly what this new company is going to do to, provide the necessary protocols to help us and protect us from where these language models may go as they move closer to AGI. But we did touch on a couple of key areas that maybe they are considering. One is, how do you deal with the overwhelming content that language models are producing and the impact that they could have on society? We also talked about language models like Stability AI and how videos and lifelike images can now be created. Fake events can be created in a digital verse and sold as if it's actually happening in real time in physical space. There's obviously a lot of work to be done there to combat that. And then we also talked about, the model layer protections or model level protections is how do you actually get inside of these neural networks and really understand how they work, how they're communicating, how they're arriving at their questions. How they're arriving at their answers. So clearly there's a lot of work to be done in the safety and security space. There's obviously an education piece to this because we also talked about like the polls we recently did, whereas people are using generative AI and don't really know that they're using generative AI. And so it's slowly creeping into our lives in wearable devices, in the devices in our homes, in our vehicles. We're slowly being surrounded by generative AI, and I don't know that everybody understands that completely yet. Based on the results of our poll, with 48% of people saying they don't use generative AI at all. And so there's clearly some, an education. There's a lot of education that still needs to occur there in terms of how these things are being used. Well, Heather and Amy, I just want to thank you for joining me today on the Wild Dog AI podcast. This topic is so important, and I think, there's going to continue to be conversation around the safety and security of these language models, especially as we move towards AGI, and its impact on the intelligence and security space is critical. It is going to be significant. And so I look forward to talking to both of you again about this topic. And Heather, next week we have a special guest coming on. Can you tell us just a little bit about who that will be?
Randy Stickley will be joining us to discuss why traditional analysis skills are still matter in the age of AI.
Well, Heather, I look forward to that next conversation. And folks, if you want to hear more conversation like this around artificial intelligence, and more specifically generative artificial intelligence and its impact on law enforcement and intelligence, feel free to follow us anywhere you listen to your podcasts. We'll see you next time. Thank you.